modern life is production and trade instead of war and conquest, and how that could be looked at as vicious or even just like amoral, like it has no moral significance. No, this is the birth of the real human way of living. And that, from a moral perspective, one should be a champion of it. So the profit motive goes to the essence of what a human life should be.
Today, we're celebrating the release of a new essay and book, Profit Without Apology, our manifesto for a moral revolution in how we think about business. It's part of the Atlas Circle, an initiative to stand up for business and empower business to stand up for itself. I'm Don Watkins, and this is the Ayn Rand Institute podcast. So I'm an author and fundraising and marketing vice president at the Ayn Rand Institute, and joining me today is Onkar Ghate, our chief philosophy officer and co-author or co-editor, I don't know how to put it, on the book, Profit Without Apology. And so I want to talk a little bit about the ideas that we're exploring here. And I mean, this is really a book about business. And I want to start off, Onkar, by talking about business as a cultural phenomenon and its importance in the culture. And so this morning, I walked around the house and I was picking up some of the most lauded books on championing free markets. Road to Serfdom by Hayek, Economics in One Lesson by Hazlitt, Free to Choose by Milton Friedman. And none of them even mentioned business in the index. Now, to be fair, Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal by Ayn Rand doesn't, but there's chapters devoted to businessmen, and businessmen play a central role, for instance, in her essay in For the New Intellectual. And having read those other books, it's striking how little business is mentioned. And I wanted to start off by, why do you think that Ayn Rand places such an emphasis on businessmen in her analysis of capitalism and in her analysis of the overarching direction of Western culture?
I think the central issue is that she appreciated more than anyone before her the role of thinking in life. You need it to identify your values, but to figure out how to produce them. So she had such an emphasis on what life is about, is producing things, that the computers and X-ray machines and airplanes and so on, all the stuff of modern life, you don't find it in nature. It's all produced by human beings. And that means, one, they had to think up these inventions, but they had to bring them to market. You had to figure out a way to build and produce airplanes in such a way that people can afford to travel in them. And the people who did that were the business leaders as individuals, forming companies and pushing the whole productive process further ahead, such that we have what we have today, which is the modern world. And you see that, I think, part of what startles people about Atlas Shrugged. I mean, there's so many things that are new in Atlas Shrugged, but just of a story where the focus is on individual businessmen and their role in life and what they bring into being for the first time, that didn't exist before. Like, the modern world is impossible without businessmen, and all the companies that you can rattle off, from Microsoft to Google to Apple, just to take in the high-tech world, that they've produced the modern world. And you couldn't have the modern world absent that. And she recognizes that more than anyone, and recognizes the role of individual thinking in the whole productive process, and that this is key to the modern world. And so she becomes a champion of it, because she's a champion of life and of progress.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really, really hard, but really, really valuable to put yourself in the place of what life was like before the modern world, before the Industrial Revolution. And part of what we touch on in the book is just the transformations in energy, finance, food, housing, communication, transportation, medicine, sanitation, even entertainment, right? Like, you didn't have amusement parks 300 years ago. And the kind of drudgery that people lived in. Just one fact that I always found striking is that a typical housewife in as late as the mid 1800s, they were carrying water to and from their house 8 to 10 times a day. And that the idea that you could just turn on a faucet, like that was an achievement. And there's been more books and more work like spelling out this achievement. I think of, and this is one of many, many such books, Robert Gordon's The Rise and Fall of American Growth, which just pounds away at these achievements. Or if you think of the progress movement and them talking about progress. But it's striking that in both of those cases, if business is mentioned, it's as an afterthought or a side issue. And what you're highlighting, and what I think Ayn Rand's highlighting, is that like that was their achievement. Like there were a lot, like you couldn't have had that absent people going into business, building companies, and that if you're going to think about how to protect and expand on that achievement, and what the threats to that achievement are, you have to be thinking, I think, about business leaders.
And one of the things that really drove it home for me was reflecting on something that I experienced in my youth after reading Ayn Rand, and when she was pointing out that what is distinctive in capitalism is the emergence of this whole class of people, of entrepreneurs and businessmen. Is I lived for a year in a communist country in Africa, in Ethiopia as a kid. And what it had is military. It had various government government buildings, including they ran the school and some of the hospitals and so on. And it had a few small businesses, like a restaurant here. But it had no, what we would call big business. It had none of the companies that you would identify in the West. No McDonald's, no IBM, nothing like that. No Toyota, Ford, GM. And it was just so incredibly poor. And it was so obvious that like the one thing that's missing is business. And it's not, they weren't missing technology. Like the know-how of how to build these things, it's been invented. They can copy inventions and so on. But what they didn't have is a business class. Because that operates under freedom. And the result was like abject poverty.
Yeah. And so given that fact that the whole modern way of life depends on business, I think it's striking and deeply troubling that the way I think about it is that we live in an anti-business culture. And you can look at that from a policy direction. Think about the podcast that we've done, saying the attacks on Silicon Valley, the resurgence of antitrust, just the whole regulatory state. But you can also think about in popular culture. I don't know if this is still true, but the last time that I looked at the research, the number one villain, like the number one kind of villain on TV and in movies, was business leaders. And if you think about somebody like Jeff Bezos, there was people outside of his home protesting years ago with a guillotine, and the whole Occupy Wall Street movement. There's kind of a relentless attack on businessmen that I want to examine. But before we examine, we should at least pause, because I think some people would push back understandably and say, well, wait a minute, like, okay, fine, everybody's attacked. How can you call it anti-business when we live in a culture that puts them on magazines where Steve Jobs was lionized? Indeed, one of the critiques that you often hear is, in effect, we give too much recognition to businessmen. And so how do you think about the kind of state of our culture with respect to business?
Yeah, so I don't think that's real recognition, and in them qua businessmen. So to the extent that there's some recognition, and the Steve Jobs is like that, Elon Musk, leave aside his involvement in politics and so on, and just the creation of, say, Starlink, Tesla, the innovations there, when they can put it as there's some kind of either technological innovation or artistic element. And I think with Steve Jobs and with Apple, there's an artistic creative. Oh, that I can get behind, that I can see as something positive, but it's very much put into, it's not about making profits and about making money. It's about pushing technology forward, doing something artistic and creative. And then when they can liken them to like an artist, like a Steve Jobs, you can liken to an artist, then you can think of something positive. But insofar as they're just making money and making billions, that's not viewed as a positive. And I think here the contrast to someone like a Jeff Bezos or a Bill Gates, when he was the richest man in the world, you couldn't as easily put them in the Steve Jobs category as there's this creative, artistic element, or they're pushing technology. There's some innovations in electric cars, like Elon Musk. I mean, he's clearly an inventor, and that you can put as in a positive. But Gates and Bezos are just extremely skilled at building massive, profitable companies, and that's viewed as like, why is that good? And so I think it's very telling in the way that, to the extent there's some recognition or even respect for them, it's not qua businessmen, it's not qua money makers, the makers of profits. And that tells you, I think, something significant, that it is, yeah, if it's just making money and making profits, that at best is something like without moral significance, but much more often it's, well, there's got to be some exploitation there qua businessmen. And I think that is the attitude today.
Yeah, and I mean, I think of the finance industry as like the ultimate example of this, right? Because here, there's not even a tangible product that people can point to. Like at least Microsoft, shipped Microsoft Word that people use. And then, the only kind of counterexample you come up with is somebody like Warren Buffett, who's striking precisely in that I think in certain respects, artificially portrays himself as, yeah, but I don't enjoy the wealth. I don't live luxuriously. I attack business. I support the left. But aside from him, I can't think of a financier who's had anything good said about them.
Yeah. And yeah, I think that's true. And going back to the issue of villains. So it would be one thing if businessmen were depicted as villains in TV and movies, where it was something corrupt about them as an individual. But it's a stereotype in that if you watch the TV and the movies, they give no explanation of the motivation. It's just the fact that they're in business means they're after money and profits, and that's the equivalent of someone who wants to steal money and cheat people. And there's no attempt to really provide motivation. It's just, well, it's a kind of stock motivation, and that tells you something about how they think these people are motivated. Like, I don't need to explain there's something corrupt. Like, if you portrayed a doctor as a villain, and there are doctors who are villains, you would have to go into, like, what is it about him that's corrupting him? The profession's not corrupt. They don't do that for business, which tells you they think of the profession as itself corrupt or pushing people towards corruption.
Yeah, and that's why I think, so if we were going to try to explain our anti-business culture, I don't think you can name it as, well, businessmen do bad things, because that's very true, but it's also very true that that people in every industry and every walk of life do bad things, and that it's precisely that's seen as flowing out of the nature of their profession. And so, I mean, we explore in the lead essay, I talk a lot about what I think the fundamental answer is. I put it here, and I'll raise an aspect that I don't talk about directly in the piece, but I'd be interested in your take on. So I think of it as that there's two philosophic ideas that drive the anti-business view. So one is the soul-body dichotomy that says that there's something low about being concerned with material things as against the higher concerns of life, and the morality of self-sacrifice that says that you have a moral duty to serve others and that there's something wicked or evil about pursuing your own interests. And then that leads to two levels of attack. So one is it's at the level of motive. That is, if people are acting in their self-interest, it's going to lead them to act destructively. And then the other is at the level of result, which is what business does is it rewards the greedy and leaves the needy without rewards. And so that's kind of like my overall framework for understanding this view, and I wonder how you think about it.
Yeah, I think both of those are at work, and think of the soul-body or mind-body dichotomy. That relates to what I was saying about a Steve Jobs versus a Bill Gates or a Jeff Bezos, that they can think of Steve Jobs, there's an artistic, creative element. That goes with the soul. Okay, I can view that as that's potentially noble, and that's something I can respect. But making thousands and thousands and millions of iPhones and so or if you take Amazon of just like shipping all these products all over the world, that's all material. I can't find this kind of artistic, soul detached from body element to it. And so, yeah, that's low. That's not worthy of respect. So the kind of reaction to it, Steve Jobs versus a Bezos or a Gates, I think part of it is the soul body dichotomy, and they can see something that they can think of as on the soul side with Jobs. But I mean, it's not true. So like, part of this is that's a false perspective. And going back to what I said at the start, and it's emphasized in this book, that Ayn Rand thinks of it as it's about thinking, and a proper conception of the soul is anybody who's sort of takes on the effort of thinking, and that's both at a theoretical level, at an artistic level, and the level of production. The amount of thinking that a Bill Gates had to do to build Microsoft, or that a Jeff Bezos starting off in his garage shipping books to building Amazon, it's just staggering, the amount of thinking. And if you have that perspective, and not like soul is supposed to be detached from body, but that thinking is supposed to advance life, which means life in the material world, you just have a radically different view, and you start to see, no, there's not a difference between a Steve Jobs and a Bill Gates. They're essentially similar. There's obviously differences between them, but it's essentially a creative thinking act that, and pushing life forward means pushing it forward in this world and in the material world. And if you think of the damnation of profits and profit making as such, it really combines the two things. That you can't make a profit if you don't eventually embody your idea into material form. There's no such thing. I mean, like Steve Jobs might come up with the idea of like a computer in your pocket, but until you actually have a computer in your pocket, which you have iPhone. I mean, first the precursors to the iPhone, but when you got to the iPhone, it has to be embodied in material form, and that's what people are buying in the millions of. That's producing the product. So that taints it from the kind of soul body that it has this material element, and then it's so obviously what it's about is trade. That the people selling and making the Apple is making money in the millions and then in the billions, and that from an altruistic perspective, well, but you're not giving it up, you're not giving it away. Trade is not alms. And so it's suspect from that perspective. So the damnation of profit comes from both aspects. It's clearly material, and it's clearly not about need. It's about trade.
Yeah, I remember when Yaron Brook and I wrote Equals Unfair. Part of what we talk about is, I mean, a number of issues relevant to this, but for instance, CEO pay. And I would ask people who were critical of it, which is, what do you think a CEO does? And it was striking how few people, including pretty sophisticated people, didn't really have a clue. Like working with CEOs, reading biographies, like that helps drive it home. But I actually think the thing that made it most real to me is just working in a business environment and thinking how hard things are. I worked in a group that there were 4 of us, just 4. And how hard it was to communicate and like have a project where everybody's on the same page and going the same direction and executing, like the level of difficulty involved in that. And then I thought, like, how in the world do you actually create something and organize something on the scale of thousands or tens of thousands of people? And so I think that, yeah, part of, I want to talk more about sort of making the case for business, but I think a foundational part of it is just helping people get the thinking that goes into value creation, helping elevate that to the surface, because you don't learn it. And if you think about even pro-business movies, for instance, where there are businessmen as heroes, you usually don't see that aspect, which is the core aspect, which is the kind of thinking and the kind of work that goes involved. It is involved in it. And it's one of the things that Atlas Shrugged, I think, is, if not unique, close to unique in bringing to the surface the kind of problems they have to solve, the kind of challenges that they have to overcome, and the kind of deep commitment to a goal that they have to carry with them through through years and indeed decades. It's it doesn't by itself solve some of the altruist attacks and the soul body perspective, but I do think it's foundational for resolving them.
Yes, and I've long thought that the remaining source of the American spirit and American sense of life is the business world. And that people remark on this, that people come out of college with a certain kind of view of business and how the world works, and then they go into the workforce. And this isn't true of everybody, but many, and the more honest people will be, yeah, what I learned in school either wasn't true or just I'm completely ignorant. I didn't learn anything about this. And running a business is so much harder than I would have thought. I mean, I can't imagine what it's like to run Amazon. Like what you were saying, just that level of coordination of people and of like all these products that you get in a day or two, the amount of thinking and coordination required that they can promise like this is 1 day shipping or 2 day shipping, and it actually, I mean, 99% of the time that's what it is. It's just so it's just such an enormous achievement. And when you get involved in it, and if you're honest about it, it was, oh yeah, like we've got this problem. Oh, and my boss came up with like this is a really good solution of how to do this, and I wouldn't have thought of this, and I wouldn't have been able to figure out how to do it profitably. Like I could hire a car and put the stuff in there, and we won't make a profit if we do that. Like how do we all do this profitably? The more you get exposed to that, the more you see, yeah, okay, this is what production is. This is why America's rich. This is what it means to actually be working. And it, for many people, it just transforms them because it's eye-opening to see what it's really like to see the business world. And because the American business is still pretty healthy, it's like you learn all kinds of positive things when you go into the business world, if you're open to it and if you're honest about what is actually happening. They don't look anything like what you see on TV and exploiters and villains when you get into an actual business and see it operating.
So I want to turn to then actually defending business. And so I went around to my bookshelves to try to figure out, okay, where are some, good examples of people at least attempting to defend business. Dinesh D'Souza wrote a whole book, The Virtue of Prosperity. But that's actually an attack on the profit motive and an attack on business. He's defending the result, but it's basically sneering at businessmen. And then I think if somebody like Milton Friedman, who I have a better view of than D'Souza, one of his most famous pieces was defending that the purpose of business should be to maximize shareholder profits. But one of the really striking things, if you read that essay, and it's really long, like it's not like he doesn't have time to make this point, he never says why pursuing profits is good. He says it's just the shareholders are after profits, and so the executive has an obligation to pursue them. But why is it right for the shareholders to be concerned with profits? There's not a single word. And at most what you find is a kind of Adam Smith sort of view that says, yeah, the profit motive is, if not evil, at least not particularly inspiring, but under certain circumstances with the right amount of freedom and with the right amount of government intervention, it leads to good social outcomes. Why do you think that that's not a sufficient argument? Because at one level, it seems right, yeah, that businessmen do produce all these good things. There are good social consequences. Why isn't that enough to kind of deactivate or answer the kinds of objections we've been talking about?
I mean, at least for two reasons. And one is in terms of thinking about the motivation, and two is thinking about the effects. So it is true from an individualist perspective that a free market and that capitalism produces good social outcomes. That is, for individuals who want to learn how to trade and to produce, who want to get better, who are ambitious, and who want to earn their way. That is, they don't want handouts. They don't want people to give them things. They don't want alms. They want to earn their way. They want to be traders. Yeah, a free society and a free market, capitalism is where you will prosper. And in that sense, like, it's a lot of individuals prospering, and you can think of that as that's a good social outcome. But the more you emphasize that what the outcome really is that needs are being satisfied. It's not that trade's going on where both people are gaining. If you're just focusing on not the people, the businesses and the big businesses producing things and making profits in the millions and the billions, you're focusing on their customers. Then there's a way in which then we put, or where it's about serving your customers. It's all trying to put it in the language of altruism. It's you're satisfying needs. Needs is what counts, and it's trying to make it like it's not really a trade. It's them giving away. And if that's not a good social outcome. And if that's how the social outcome is sort of processed, then it's, well, we need more of this. We need more of a giving away of alms and so on. And if businesses don't do it, then we have to make them do it because that's what the good is. And you're like pounding that idea in. The more you advocate, well, it's about service and look at the people whose needs are being met. If you're just activating, well, that's what we should be doing morally. And then that brings to the motivation. It has to be that it's like, to put it mildly, a strange logic of the way to achieve good results is to be badly motivated. And so you want people who are driven by self-interest and profit because that somehow is going to be transformed into some good social outcome. So you want to sort of teach people to be badly motivated. Wouldn't it work better if we just taught them from the start to be well motivated and they should be thinking about the needs of others and serving others and so on? Isn't that what we should be doing? Like, how will that produce a bad outcome? And it pushes towards, like, why don't we just try to change people's motivation and tell them not to be so self-interested, not to pursue profits. And like, that's the much more logically satisfying conclusion than it is, no, we have to teach people to be badly motivated in order to get good results.
So, I mean, in the book, we spend a lot of time in several of the pieces. I've mentioned my manifesto, which was just released on our Substack yesterday. You can go to atlascircle.com to see that. You talk a lot about it in Atlas Shrugged, America's Second Declaration of Independence. And it comes up in some of the other pieces. So I don't want to go too much in depth in this, but what do you think if we were going to name the essence of Ayn Rand's case for the profit motive? What is the core that you think constitutes her defense of that motive?
That the desire for profits is the desire to produce and create values. And trade is just a sophisticated form of advancing your life. That if you lived, say, on the American frontier in the 18th century, it's, you have something more like a self-sustaining farm, but you have to build that. Like, you're building that from the wilderness, and that's what life is about. It's producing the things that you need. The profit motive becomes when there's a real division of labor, and now it's not like I need to sort of directly produce all the goods that my life requires and try to produce as much as I can in order to move my life and the life of my family forward. It's, I can specialize, but what I still need to do is produce something valuable as reflected that people will buy it and find it valuable to buy things from me, and I'll use the proceeds to buy things from them. And so it's still, the essence is about profit, is about the desire to produce the values that moves your life forward. And you're doing that with other people who are trying to move their life forward. And far from that being some kind of despicable activity, it's the essence of life, and you should want to be surrounded with people who are also motivated by profit. That is because everybody's then trying to push their life forward, and they're doing it by figuring out new ways to produce and new ways to trade with one another. And that's the modern life, is production and trade instead of war and conquest. and how that could be looked at as vicious or even just like amoral, like it has no moral significance. No, this is the birth of the real human way of living. And that, from a moral perspective, one should be a champion of it. So the profit motive goes to the essence of what a human life should be.
Yeah. So the call to action of this podcast is to read the book, but the call to action of the book includes this idea of businessmen standing up. And we've talked about that in this podcast. We talk about it in the book. You've given a talk that I think inspired this whole perspective on why it's important for businessmen to champion their work. I want to ask one question I don't think that we explored. What do you think is the role of intellectuals in that? Because, we're an intellectual organization, and there's often, I think, a skepticism among businessmen that like intellectuals are practical, just as there's a suspicion among many intellectuals that businessmen are good. And so how do you think about what intellectuals and the role of philosophy is? What does that bring to the table for businessmen from the perspective of their need to stand up for their work?
Yeah, I think it does two things. So one, it helps them directly give full voice and understanding to themselves of why what they do is good, why it's productive, and why it's worthy of moral esteem. So it's not just, so I put it in terms of the contrast and say a Jeff Bezos and a Steve Jobs, that if you can put Steve Jobs as he has an artistic, creative element to him, like an artist, then you can think, okay, there's something good about that. It's not like just the opponents of business think that. It's many businessmen think that and think that what they do is, it doesn't really have moral significance unless there's this kind of artistic, creative soul element that's detached from the material world and from the body, as we were talking about before. And it's the opposite of the truth. And businessmen, they might sense that about their own activity. But there's a big difference just in terms of one's satisfaction with one's own life if you just have a sense of that and if you have full voice and articulation of that. And many people will say, for Ayn Rand in general and Atlas Shrugged in particular, that, yeah, she said all the things that I was thinking. And I don't think that's literally true, but there's something about that. It's like it's much more, she said all the things that I was feeling, and they couldn't understand or give voice to their feeling. And it's such a positive thing to have a perspective on, to know why what you're doing is good. So that's one element of it, that intellectuals should help businessmen understand what they're doing and why it's good. And part of it's worse than a tragedy that what intellectuals did was turn against businessmen and try to tell them what you do is evil and completely distort what they actually do. And so what they should be doing is helping them understand. And then more broadly, it's part of what intellectuals do is help people understand the world. And so it's to help everybody understand the role of business in life. And that will be enormously positive for the businessmen who are pushing life forward. The more people who understand what they actually do and why it's good, the more free they will be. And that's obviously of benefit to them, but it's a benefit to everyone else. So it's a whole educational role that the intellectuals play, and it's pretty much, they play it for good or evil. They're either going to teach good things about business and the world of capitalism or bad things, but they're not going to stay mute about it. And so those are the two alternatives. And we're unfortunately still in the minority of the people who will talk about business and why it's good. And we need more of that.
All right. So you can buy Profit Without Apology on Amazon, of all places. And you can read the opening essay, the manifesto, by going to atlascircle.com. And please do sign up for a Substack. We're still in early stages, but much more is to come there. So stay tuned. As always, subscribe, comment, and share. And you can send your comments and questions to newideal@aynrand.org. Onkar, thanks for helping me put this book together, and thanks for being part of this podcast.
Thanks, Don.